Hello, folks. How are you? Good evening, and welcome to our event tonight. I'm Brad Schmidt. I'm the Inside Nashville columnist, and I'm really excited to be started because it gives me reason to stop eating all the brownies. I've had 7. So, really very excited you're here. The live streaming has begun, so if you're sitting next to somebody you shouldn't be, too late. But we're very glad you're here tonight. So listen, we're in a brand new, beautiful venue. I love this space, and not just because it feels like you're about to vote in the state senate. Or how many people had Econ 101 in a room that looked just like this, right? Exactly. Mr. Bolton, thank you. So we're really excited about the venue, and thank you so much to St. Thomas. And also, we have one of my colleagues, reporter Adam Tambourine, is co-hosting for the first time. So will you please make Adam feel welcome?
Thank you. And thank you, Brad. I'm really excited to be here. I'm mostly excited to hear the stories we're going to hear tonight. So I'm going to try to keep it brief. But I wanted to just reiterate, it's really great that we're here today because, as Jessica said, the Tennessean has really been working hard this year to cover the issue of mental health from a lot of different angles and the way that mental health can play out in different ways across the state. We have had coverage about efforts to decriminalize mental health in our court system and about the ways that people challenge to get help for mental illnesses depending on where they live in the state. The challenges are very different if you're in a rural area versus an urban area like we're in right now. So you can take a look at all that at Tennessean.com. I really encourage you to look and look for issues about mental health. They're featured pretty prominently, and we've got a lot of coverage for you guys to check out.
Thank you very much, Adam. So one of the reasons that we decided to do this is that we really want to strip away a lot of stigma around mental health issues, right? We hear a lot of people pretty regularly and loosely use words like, oh boy, that person's crazy, that person's nuts. Not really thinking that every time we say that sort of throwaway phrase that we're actually increasing the stigma around mental illness. And we heard Brian from St. Thomas say earlier, 1 in 5 folks has a form of mental illness. 1 in 5 is 20%. I mean, that's a lot. And that looks like anything from depression to anxiety to multiple personality disorder to really a substance use disorder. It just looks like a whole lot of different things, and the thing is, everyone knows somebody with some form of a mental health issue, and I will say that I'm one of them. I take an antidepressant every morning, and I also have substance use disorder, which in more common vernacular means I'm a recovering addict. And so this night, it just means a lot to me, personally. In fact, one of the storytellers is a brother of mine, and I'm just really excited that this issue is getting some of your attention. And really, I'm excited to hear from, I consider all the storytellers now my friends, because this is really vulnerable stuff. They're telling you some really personal things that do have some stigma around them. I mention that because tonight's about storytelling. It's not speeches or TED Talks or how-to. Tonight is just people sharing with you, and some of the moments are going to be funny, but some of them are really intense, and some of them are really painful parts of people's lives that they are standing in front of you with microphones and lights and cameras and an audience. And so I say that to say, let's welcome them as all of our storyteller audiences have done in the past. Let's welcome folks with some empathy and grace. Don't you feel? I mean, can you do that with me? Is that cool? I appreciate that, because that's how we want to receive everybody here. So thank you for that, and Adam's going to go ahead and get us started.
All right, I'm ready. So we're going to hear tonight, as you've heard, from people who are living with mental illness, and we'll also hear from those who are or have been very close to people with mental health issues. Our first storyteller will share his journey of surviving trauma. Please welcome Carl Bolton.
All right, Carl.
Hello. As an adult, I recognize that my story of childhood was a tragedy. But as a child, going through what I was going through, I didn't have the capacity. And the reason is that human beings have an unbelievable capacity for normalization. We can go through the most difficult things imaginable and continue walking through our life. My sexual abuse started at age 5, and it went on for a decade, until I was 15. And every friend that I had growing up that was close to me was sexually abused by the same person. And a lot of times when I tell my story, I get the question of, and where were your parents during this time? And I have to say that they were exactly where they are tonight, which is here. Yeah. Yeah, mom and dad. They saw the signs, they saw the symptoms, and they took me to professionals. And I wasn't ready to tell my story. But when I knew at least 2 people that I could go to. So my wall of normalization lasted for quite a while. The adaptations that I came up with as a very small child lasted a surprisingly long time, until I was about 12. And when I was 12, things started to slowly come unfolded. It was when I started abusing alcohol, and when I started abusing drugs, and I began self-injuring, and I started having consensual but inappropriate sexual relationships. And I was severely, severely depressed. And I remember walking through my middle school, and I would play a game with myself every day of how long will it take for somebody to notice me, right? Because I just felt invisible, and I was looking for confirmation that it was okay for me to just leave the world. And so my abuse went on for another 3 years after that. It ended when I was 15. And by the time I got there, I was not in a good way. But this is the end of the 90s, the early 2000s era, and that was the time where miniseries, you remember miniseries? They were like coming to an end, and the Lifetime movie was coming about. And there was there always came in like themes, so it was like earthquakes, and everyone would do earthquakes, or tornadoes, and everyone would do. And one of them that was my favorite one was The Intervention. And the story was always the same. So it's like Susan is the leader of the cheerleading squad, and everything falls apart because Susan started using heroin. And my favorite part of the movie, all of them are the same. My favorite part of the movie was when Susan would come home and her family would be sitting in front of her, and she'd go, "Oh crap." And she'd run for the door, but Susan's mom would get up and grab her by the arm, and she'd pull her in, and Susan would struggle. And then she would cry. And then the rest of the family would come around, and they would just say, "We love you. Please let us help you. Please let us help you." And as a kid, that was my fantasy. Yeah. And in that, I created a story that I could survive. So my intervention came at 16. And I went to my parents, right, because they've always been there. And we talk a lot about in the mental health field about creating scaffolding for young people, that if they're not ready to do the construction today, can we set them up to do it in the future? And that's exactly what happened. I entered into what we call recovery at age 16. I was extremely blessed to have some incredible resources available to me as an adolescent, that many of which are still available today. And from the beginning of my recovery, people pretty frequently were saying to me, like, you probably should go to therapy, right? There's because I'd been through a lot, and I wasn't hiding my abuse from anyone. But my whole thinking about therapy was like, I went through 10 years of that. What does a therapist have to tell me, right? And flawed or not, that was my feeling. And what that was a continuation of normalization. It was a continuation of a survival strategy that I just picked up again. And it worked. It worked for about 3.5 years. And I was confronted again with a come apart. And I had a decision at that point in time of either, even though I was young, I can either start over at the beginning or I can try to nip this in the bud. And so I decided to do that. So I went to treatment again, and this time I went specifically for trauma. And drove myself down to New Orleans and stayed for 30 days at a place with people just like me. And I found out that everyone minimizes their trauma. We all do it. It's a way that we survive it, is to make it smaller. And I learned to tell my story, and I learned to breathe. And I came back to Nashville a new person, and I had the opportunity to go to therapy at Sexual Assault Center. And for those of you who don't know what Sexual Assault Center is, it is probably one of Nashville's greatest jewels. It is a nonprofit that focuses on the advocacy and treatment of sexual assault survivors for Davidson County, and they are literal angels. And I'll say this real quickly, that one time I was waiting on my appointment with my therapist at Sexual Assault Center. I was looking at one of the pamphlets, and it said, this is our mission statement. Sexual Assault Center's mission statement is to end sexual violence, period. Yeah. And I asked my therapist about that, and he said, why would we set our goal any lower? And so I started therapy, and I met some incredible men, and I started to get better. I stopped having nightmares and waking up in cold sweats. I stopped feeling as alone. I stopped feeling as crazy. And I went to Sexual Assault Center for 2 years on scholarship. 2 years on scholarship because I couldn't afford to pay for that much therapy. I got to the end of the 2 years, and my therapist confronted me, and he said, look, we've gone a long way. I've seen you through a lot of things, but the reality of it is that you have plateaued. And I see that there is some growth left to do. So I'm supportive of you, but I'm supportive of you in the change process. So what do you want to do? And so I remembered from when I went to trauma treatment, there was this therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And I didn't remember a dang thing about dialectical behavior therapy except for this. It came with a giant binder with tons and tons of worksheets and handouts and all this stuff. And I was like, if I can just get my hands on that sucker, I can memorize all that crap. Because there's all sorts of coping mechanisms and skills and yada, yada, yada. And so that's what I did. I sought out a therapist. And I prepared for therapy in only a way that a neurotic perfectionist can, which is that I bought some very expensive software for mind mapping. And if you don't know what mind mapping is, it's an elaborate way of diagramming. So I've got this software, and I prepared for my first therapy session by creating a diagram. At the very center of it, it said, "What's wrong with Carl?" And then literally, I'm not exaggerating, probably 250 points around what is Carl were points color-coded of possibilities. Right? So it was, depression and trauma and yada, yada, yada. And the whole point was that I was done with the equation in my head of what the heck do I do? And so I went to therapy, and I sat down with her, and I was feeling very full of myself. I was slid the diagram across there. I was like, you might need this. And she looked at me in that very therapist way, and she went, I just might. Yeah. And she put it in the file, never to be seen again. And so I entered into dialectical behavior therapy, and pretty quickly my therapist picked up on my game of memorization, and she was confronted me on it pretty early on and said, you do realize that you actually have to do this stuff, right? You can't just memorize the worksheets. And I was like, well, come on, Debbie Downer over here. Well, I know now. And so I practiced these worksheets. And as I practiced what was on these worksheets, I was learning these skills that were helping me to redesign my brain in ways that I really hadn't anticipated when I was just looking for a binder to memorize. I learned that not only could I practice a skill to get through a really hard time, I actually can reprogram my brain through action. Yeah. And so to say that, so, and I'll say this, I was very defiant about psychotropic medicines, especially antidepressants, and I will happily say I am on antidepressants today and I am compliant. But during this time, I didn't want to, for whatever reason. A part of my story was just that I needed to do that. And I will tell you that I went from major depression, severe, to mild, just with the therapy. And so, here's the problem, though. Every time I would go to therapy, my therapist and I would sit down, and I would always want to bring the chart back up. What's wrong with Carl? What's wrong with Carl? What's wrong with Carl? And my therapist confronted me one day, and we sat down. She said, look, we're not going to do things like normal today. We're going to do something different. And honest to God, my first thought was, oh my God, she's about to fire me. I was like, oh my God, like she's literally about to fire me. What a loser. Oh man. And she said, no, like, look, Carl, what if there's nothing wrong with you? And then I really wanted to pull out the chart. Okay, pull it out. Like, there's 250 points. Okay, I'll color cut number 16A in hot pink on the left-hand side. Tell me that ain't something wrong with me, right? And she said, no, listen to me. What if there's nothing wrong with you? What if you were just trying to build a life worth living? And this floored me. It absolutely floored me. Because my whole idea of survival at this point was about the chart. If I can just find out what the hell is wrong with me, then maybe I can have some freedom. It never occurred to me that maybe there's not anything. Maybe I am just valiantly trying to build a life worth living. There's no magical answer at the end of this. That's the path I still am on right now, of stepping into what does recovery look like without the idea something's wrong with me. And that's the path that I will probably continue from here on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. I think that's a story a lot of us can relate to, and certainly something I can relate to. At least being obsessed with Lifetime movies when I was a teenager. Anyway, we'd like to thank St. Thomas Health, a part of Ascension, for hosting us and for sponsoring tonight's event. And thanks for the free parking, too. I have no idea where my car is, but it's somewhere and it's parked there free. So. We'd also like to thank our Tennessean storytelling crew, Heather Cass, Jessica Bliss, who you've met already, Brad Schmidt, Erica Whitney and Kylia Dunn, and Dustin Barnes as well. Also, the Tennessean's top leadership is here. That's our bosses. Many thanks to Michael Anastasi and Maria Devereen for supporting the Storytellers program.
Thank you. So back to our storytellers. Now, you guys know that first responders save lives, all the time in our city in all sorts of different ways, but it's not just rushing into burning buildings or stopping armed robbers or giving CPR. Metro Police Sergeant Will Admonson, he's most definitely a hero, but he used words and kindness to rescue a man in distress. Will you please welcome Sergeant Admonson?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would argue that I didn't earn that distinction, but I would tell you that on a warm day in May, I got a call. It was a 1063, and what that means is it's a suicidal person. And I remember the call coming out, and we headed to probably one of the tallest buildings that I now recognize in the area I work in Midtown Hills. And I remember getting to the building, getting into the front of the building, and there wasn't really a whole lot going on. It wasn't, overly chaotic, and riding an elevator 17 floors up to the very, very top of the building. And at the very top, it was this kind of panoramic of the city. Just one of the prettiest views I've seen, and I've been all over in every different part of the city. And I remember going up and kind of searching. The text of the call was that an individual was at the top of the building wanting to jump off of the building. And that's a call that's not all too uncommon. But what I found as I turned the corner was a man that was actually hanging off of the ledge of the building. He had about 3 inches just kind of in between him and falling 17 floors. So I turned the corner, I made contact with him, and I started to talk to him. Before, in police experience, and probably something that you may have seen on the news, is that we repeat the same thing over and over again. But with us, that's not really what we do anymore. We try to engage, we talk. We actually have partners at the Mental Health Cooperative that come out and teach us how to talk. So I was able to talk to this individual. We talked about, where he grew up. We talked about the landmarks. We talked about Cape Hope. We talked about music. We talked about stuff that we really enjoyed. And before I go any further and get off of the, proverbial ledge, I want to talk a little bit about culture. And culture is something in law enforcement that you guys probably hear about and read about a whole lot, and you rarely get to hear about it from someone who's a part of that culture. And for me, kind of getting a glimpse of the culture at the department I work in really started as a very, very young officer. I responded to a call. A group of juveniles had robbed a Kiewit sack up in Antioch. And when they robbed the Kiewit sack, they took a shot at the clerk. They narrowly missed him by about 2 inches. We responded to the scene. We were able to catch all of the offenders. We go back over to the store, go through everything with the business owner. And I remember coming into the store or coming into work the next day, a little bit elated, proud of the work that we'd done. I remember my boss said something to me that really has stuck with me over the years. He said, I want you to go out to the store and I want you to check on the store owner. I want you to check on him and see how he is. I remember as a very young police officer, I was like, why do I have to do that? That's not fighting crime. But I remember going out and interacting with this guy. I remember as soon as I got into the opening of the store, this individual who didn't speak English came out and he greeted me with a handful of water. And just the visceral emotion in his face is something that I can't put into words. That's kind of the culture that we're engaging in now. It's a culture of engagement, a culture of communication. The realities that your police officers see out here in the street are stuff that we can't show you. I can sit up here and I can talk to you about what I saw and what I experienced, but I can't take you to a shooting scene and show you what it's like to put a tourniquet on a 13-year-old who's shot in the leg, who's bleeding, crying, and asking you to hold his hand. I can't do that. I can talk about it, but it's the emotion and the reality that we see is oftentimes different from the perception. And in this particular incident, we have gotten really, really into incorporating our mental health partners and engaging and communicating. So much so that when we teach training on how to talk to people with mental illness, Middle Tennessee Mobile Crisis, our mental health professionals come out and administer the training. They're part of the training. They're the role players. They're the person in crisis. And for me, being a part of that training, seeing that training, and implementing that training was very vital in the success. And so back to the ledge, I'm talking to this individual. Initially, when we started talking, one can only imagine how distraught he was. He's literally hanging on the ledge of a building. He said that he had hit this proverbial wall that he couldn't get off of. He said that there was just no hope. There was nothing. And we talked for 15 minutes. He talked about the music he liked, which was like AC/DC, and I talked about like country folk music that I like. So we couldn't really connect there, but we moved on. And talked about vacations, talked about just anything you can think about. We tried to talk about. And eventually, him crying and him being upset, I was able to see a little glimmer of a smile. And after about 15 minutes of talking, he looked over at me and he said, "I'm ready." and I really didn't know what that meant. So I was like, okay, what are you ready for? And he said, I'm ready to get off, but I can't. I need your help. And so I walked over to the ledge, and I helped him over the ledge, and we were able to get him the help that he needed. And I think everyone in this room and anyone watching has probably experienced a point in their life where they reach a proverbial ledge, if not a literal ledge. And, I can't take credit for doing anything special. I just went and talked to a man and did my job. But what he did was special. He had the courage to get the help that he needed. And I would hope that if anyone else finds themselves there, that they would get the help that they needed. But culturally, with us, the sanctity of life is what's most precious. That's what we want to save. That's what we want to preserve. We want to preserve the lives of those that suffer from mental illness. Brad mentioned earlier running into burning buildings. We'll leave that to the firefighters. They're a little bit better at that. But I want to thank you guys for inviting us here, give you a little glimpse of our culture and kind of what I experienced that day with that gentleman. And I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate it very much. It was interesting when we were talking to him, getting ready for this, like the changing, it used to be, remember he said, say the same thing over and over again, get down from the ledge, get down from the ledge, get down from the ledge. And now he was talking about finding points to connect where they remind him of happy memories, right? That's why the music and the vacations and to try to spur some sort of joyful, to give them that glimmer of hope that gives him the opportunity to reach out his hand and say, let's come off that ledge. And it's really, and I do think that's heroic, whether he wants to think so or not. I think that's very heroic and really appreciate what you did there, Sergeant. Also wanted to say that it was interesting that he mentioned the Mental Health Cooperative, which, if you don't know, is an agency that deals with folks who don't have the insurance or maybe the money to seek mental health help. And because of you folks, we're going to be, and quite literally, money coming out of the tickets that you bought, we're going to give $500 to the Mental Health Co-op tonight. So thank you guys very much for buying your tickets. In fact, we've given over $6,000, and where's Maureen, who I think has been to every Nashville Storyteller since we started this thing. Thank you so much. How many other folks have been to multiple Storytellers events? Awesome. Thanks so much for coming back. So we really appreciate you guys, because that's your $6,000 that we've been able to give to the not-for-profits around Nashville. Real quick, Centerstone is out there as well. Centerstone is another not-for-profit who deals with mental health issues. They have staff here and a table and literature. There is some literature from the Mental Health Co-op. The folks from STARS Nashville who deal with youth. Some of those folks are here today. Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for the work you do. And thank you for the work that all the not-for-profits do to help the folks who need it the most in town. We really appreciate your efforts there and your effort in helping us make the donation tonight. Thank you.
So the parents, siblings, and children of people with mental illnesses can face challenges that most of us don't have to. Our next storyteller is the mother of a boy with mental health issues. Please welcome LaWanda McKinnon.
Hello, everybody. They say parenting does not come with a handbook. I did not know how true this statement was until my journey began. First, I would like to start by saying I was blessed to have raised two unique and wonderful young men, but who are different in their own way. I have one that I have just sent off to college to become a mechanical engineer, and I have one that just needed a little bit of extra special love and care and support. So I will take you back with me 11 years ago. My younger son was diagnosed with an initial diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD in 2012. He would later go on to be diagnosed with DMDD, which stands for Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder. The definition of DMDD is children with severe and frequent temper tantrums that affect their daily activities at school, with friends, and at home. My son was about 3 years old when I noticed something was a little bit off with his mood. He would wake up irritable, upset, and just mad for no reason. I was concerned, but I just assumed that this was something that would work itself out. And honestly, I did not read a lot into the situation. I got a job at a local hotel and was a front desk clerk, which operated 24/7. And at the time, my younger son was in daycare. It seemed almost every day I was receiving a call to come to the daycare because my son was having severe temper tantrums. I would get to the center and he would be calm, but the teachers would begin to describe the behaviors they seen, such as eloping out of the classroom, turning over trash cans that were taller than him, running into the bathroom, tearing up tile, and being aggressive with the other children. These descriptions of my son's behavior had me defensive. I was embarrassed. I was in disbelief. I just knew that they were not telling the truth. I was fearful of what was happening, but could not quite understand why this was happening to me. I always asked lots of questions about the incidents, but over the next several months, these calls came every day, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day. Just to further let you know, I was not in a position where I could constantly leave my job, but I pushed to be allowed to go and support the center no matter what. So not only was I defensive in learning that my son was not acting right in school, I was also constantly in fear that I was going to lose my job because me leaving all the time caused tension. But my coworkers were supportive to a certain extent. The behaviors became constant, so it affected my work and basically how they viewed me as a person. I was always a sensitive person anyway, but the more I had to go and support my son in school, the more defensive and helpless I became. Whenever I had to go to management and ask to leave, I felt bad because I felt like I was not carrying my weight. My ability to be at work was a problem, and I felt so helpless because I was trying to figure out how to support my son while trying to keep my head above water and still go to work and smile. I can remember me breaking down and just sobbing for hours trying to understand what was happening. At this point, I knew something was wrong, but I chose to ignore. I was in constant contact with family and friends, and everybody had an opinion about what I needed to do and how I needed to do it. And it was just overwhelming. I would call and ask for advice, but when I did not like the advice, I would become argumentative and defensive and try to explain why I didn't want to take the advice. These days were dark, and I felt really down on myself, but I kept pushing on. Toward the end of my son's daycare years, I spoke with the director. She pulled me to the side and said, "Ms. McKinnon, we love you. We love your son. We've loved having him here these years, but you're going to have a problem when you get to public schools. 0 tolerance. He's not going to really survive." This statement would ring true to me the following year. As my son entered kindergarten, the difficulties he was having was becoming more and more clear. I got my first call, and the teacher claimed he did not want to participate, and he thought the class was laughing at him. So he acted like he was shooting the class, and he was suspended for 2 days for 0 tolerance. I was devastated. I was so unsure of what I needed to do, and they suggested looking into getting an IEP for my son, which is an individualized education program. The day my world completely changed was when I got the call from the school stating my son had hit a parent with a backpack in the hall. I was devastated. I was like, "What do you mean?" I just could not understand why this was happening to me. Why me? And I kept asking God, why me? And what is going on right now? I rushed to the school in a panic, and all I could say was, "Oh my God. Something has got to give." I went to the office and spoke with the principal in total disbelief that he had actually hit an adult with a backpack. I looked at my son and asked, "Why did you do this?" And he just shrugged his shoulders with such an innocent look and said, "I don't know." I felt like, how can you not know? Like, why do you not know? And I asked again, like, why do you not know? Same look. He looked at me and said, I don't know. At this moment in time, I knew this was seriously not normal. So I told myself, I've got to figure out what I needed to do. I knew that I was operating in a world unknown, but when I looked at my baby, I knew I had to fight. I had to fight for his rights. I had to fight for him a free and fair and appropriate education. I was desperate to find a solution that worked right now. I wanted this to end right now. I wanted to make whatever my son was going through go away right now. I did not want to hear another description of the behaviors my son was having because I just knew there had to be a resolution. Over the next several years, the challenges and struggles would prove extensive. My journey started at Centerstone, but it did not end there. I sought out professional counseling for myself and my son. I enrolled in parenting classes. I tried youth groups. I enlisted several agencies to help support me in school, in the school setting, and I had him tested in every avenue you could think of. As I am in the midst of trying to get all the resources in place for my son, I was still getting calls. He was still having outbursts. He was then 7 years old, and now he was getting arrested for his behaviors, such as refusing to go to class or cursing at teachers. And I could not believe or understand why my child was even arrested when he had a diagnosable mental health illness. He was receiving bruises and contusions. And I kept telling others and documenting, but I could never get full support from the school. I felt like they were brushing us out the door, and I also felt like, why are you arresting my son when there are kids that are bringing weapons to school and still in school? It made no sense to me, but I continued to ask questions. But the behaviors and the struggles continued. I felt so useless. I felt like I was not a good mother. I felt like I was failing my son. I would literally go to work in the morning and look at other children on the bus stop. And I would see other children and not have a clue what was going on with them or what struggles they may be facing. And I always thought those parents are so lucky to be able to go to work and not get a single call, not have to leave their jobs. It didn't affect their livelihood. And I just thought they were so lucky. But I also knew these kids were not my kid. And I needed to focus on making sure he is set up for success and not slip through the cracks of a system that did not understand my child had an alternative learning style. I can remember going into the meeting with administrators and educators so defensive. And I wrote down everything. I wanted a copy of anything I signed, and I demanded we go over and over what his needs were. I often refer to myself as the three-headed beast who loved her baby and wanted him treated just like everyone else, even though he was designed differently. I carried around 4 to 5 backpacks in my trunk, still unbelievable, of so many documents and discipline reports and papers and IEP plans and handbooks and resources of who I talked to and what we talked about. My determination grew stronger when people told me that we could not do this or we could not do that, or he didn't qualify for this or he didn't qualify for that. I said, okay, let me try something different. I'm going to find somebody who will help us and what he can qualify for. So I had to push a few doors and knock a whole lot of walls down to get things done. But I did. I was not going to let society or anyone tell me my child was less than. I knew he was something special. I had countless people tell me how wonderful my son was, how helpful and determined he was, how kind and gentle he could be, how remorseful he was after every incident, how he was apologetic when he calmed down, how he was smart and intelligent when he was focused, how he was also a great athlete. He had a passion for baseball at a young age, and I just made sure he stayed in baseball to have an outlet. Now, did I want to remove him at times? Yes. I felt that I was rewarding him for his bad behaviors, and I would constantly get support from people around me who said he needs an outlet. Please let him play, and I did. I think him being on that field is something he looks forward to. And all the stigma and the disappointment went away because he could prove he was great at something. And it made me proud to be able to congratulate him on something that had nothing to do with school or schoolwork. I am just now starting to see all the hard work pay off and breathe just by being able to stand up here and tell you guys my story. He has seemed to become more stable, but we have our ups and downs, as I like to call them, setbacks. And it can be overwhelming at times. I do become frustrated knowing that this may be a lifelong battle that we have to deal with. But I always tell both of my boys, nothing or no one can stop what God has for you. So no matter how my son is designed, he will shine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LaWanda. Tonight is so special because Brad and I, the reporters in the room, get to talk to people all the time about these intensely emotional challenges they're facing and the ways that they're running through those brick walls in front of them to get help for the people who need it the most. And tonight you get to hear it straight from them, and it's beautiful. Thank you so much, LaWanda. You can read more about LaWanda's story at Tennessean.com. And you can also read about other brick walls that face people who are trying to get help for mental illness around the state. And you can read about other people like LaWanda who are trying to run through those brick walls and get help. People like teachers, people like pastors, people like doctors who are trying to find new ways to get help to people who need it. Later this year, I will have a story about how colleges are dealing with an influx of students who need treatment for mental health issues in between their classes, and you can look forward to that at Tennessean.com as well. So we have a lot of coverage coming and a lot of coverage that's already there about these issues that I really hope you'll check out.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thank you. Appreciate that. You know what? Part of the reason we can do all that journalism and the investigation and bringing this event up is because of our subscribers. And so, as you know, the Nashville Storytellers veterans, we treat you with a fairy tale brownie whenever you come, because I forgot to buy the cookies for everybody else. Everyone gets brownies tonight. But please know that there is a slight sweet incentive, and we do appreciate them sponsoring us very much. We've got a couple more storytellers for you tonight, and including our next storyteller, one of the youngest storytellers to ever be part of Nashville Storytellers. And she is just awesome and really brave. And will you please welcome Cisela Hernandez.
My story begins when I was about 9 to 10 years old, and my family was moving from Tennessee to Texas because of economic problems. And during that, my family lost their home. My dad and my brother stayed in Texas because of jobs, and my mom and I moved to Tennessee, and we moved in with a family member. In this home, I was sexually abused. And during that time, my mom, she was working night shifts, so I would spend most of my time alone. And when I would go to school, it was really hard to make friends because I was a new student. And I remember people would bully me because I did not dress like them. I did not do my hair like them. And I had more leg hair than the boys in my class. And I remember just feeling shame and humiliated. And then when I would go home, I felt scared, not having my parents around. And then came around middle school, and I was transitioning to 5th grade. And here I made a mental note that I did not want to be bullied again. And so when I entered that middle school, I was determined to be the bully. And I remember going into the girls' restrooms and pushing girls around. And I remember I would just pick on people. And I just felt that satisfaction. When I entered 6th grade, it's when I started to change. I was becoming a preteen. And so, I really couldn't control much of the anger I carried inside. I carried anger because I did not have a normal life. And I remember one time I was sitting in my science class and I just wanted attention. I wanted somebody to hear me. And I remember I got a scissor from the little cubby my teacher kept. And I got a scissor and I started to carve my arm. And there, that teacher, she yelled at me and she told me to leave and to go to the counselor's office. And once again, I felt humiliated because that was not the attention I wanted. And so when I left that room, I slapped the door behind me. And I was walking towards the counselor's office. I was halfway there when I saw my hero. And I call him my hero because when he saw me, he immediately stopped me. And he told me, he's like, let's sit down, let's have a chat. And there, he was the first person to ask me, what's wrong? How can I help you? And I remember I didn't tell him anything that was wrong. I just looked at him and listened to him. And I remember he touched my arm and he told me, don't do this ever again. And then every day, as I got off my bus, he would always smile at me, always ask me how my parents were doing. And this bond began with me and him. And so fast forward to my freshman year, I felt better and I was determined to be the best. I didn't want to be the mean person again. If you ask my peers from middle school, who was Cicela, they would always tell you, oh, she was mean, she was a bully. And so my freshman year, I had my fresh start. I had a fresh start to not be the one being picked on, the one not bullying. I wanted to be the best. So I did. And I was one of the top students of my class. I was involved in pretty much everything. And then when I came across a program from Lipscomb called Pioneros, it caught my eye because it's a scholarship program for students who want to become teachers and are minorities. And I saw that as a hope. I saw that as my chance. So I worked really hard. And I remember just this aspiration I had to become a teacher. I wanted to be that hero that person was back in middle school. So I worked really hard. Fast forward to senior year, and I'm class president of my senior class. And my senior year of high school, I had so many goals. This is the year I'm going to get into my dream school. I'm going to do everything, all the activities with my senior class. But in December of my senior year, I decided to tell my parents what had happened to me back in my childhood. And I remember the night I told them. I remember seeing their faces. But one thing I always will thank God is because my parents were so loving. Because my dad told me that nothing would ever change between us. And he told me he would always support me in every decision I would make. So I moved on. But in February, I got a knock on my door at 6 in the morning. And it was a sheriff. And he served me saying I was being sued for $25,000 for character defamation. And I said, why? Why all this time I kept quiet, and now I finally speak out. I'm being served with this. And that day was the day of my interview for my scholarship. And I was like, what am I gonna do? But I had one thing. I was for sure I was gonna defend myself to the fullest. So I took that paper to school. And when I got to the school building, the first person who saw me was my principal. You know, I was pretty well known at school. So when he saw my face, he was like, what's wrong? And I just gave him the paper. And I was like, look. And he just looked at it. And with disbelief, he just told me to sit in his office and he would get help. So pretty soon after, I had this team with me from school. All these teachers who cared for me. And they all got me the help. They got me an attorney. They got me to the sexual assault center, a place where I could finally get some help to talk about what had been going on with me for all these years. And I remember I felt distracted. I felt like, how am I going to achieve my dream? How am I going to go? How am I going to graduate from high school? I had to step down from my place as a senior class president because I couldn't even speak in front of my SGA group. It was hard. But then fast forward to March. This is the day I was going to be told if I were going to get my scholarship or not. And that day, God blessed me with that scholarship. And that day, I was like, okay, God, you haven't left me alone. So I'm going to fight. I'm going to continue to fight. And so here I am. I'm at my dream school. And I'm going to continue to be the best because I want to continue to achieve that dream, to become that hero for that student. Because you never know who you're going to come across to. You never know whose life you're going to save. So I want to say thank you to that teacher who's not here today, but I know he knows what he did for me. And I want to tell y'all, never deny a smile to a child. Never, because you never know whose life you're going to save. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cicella. That is some bravery there, folks. Can we have one more hand for Cicella, please? Thank you, and her parents are here supporting, and glad you're here. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My goodness. So we really do appreciate so much all of the vulnerability from all of our storytellers. We do have one I wanted to let you know about coming up because I think we have a wrong date in one of our pieces of literature, but it's December 3rd, and that's going to be Ladies' Night. It's going to be 5 powerful, interesting, unique, and awesome women. And it'll be the first time we have a single gender night at Nashville Storytellers, which means I get a night off from hosting, so that's pretty awesome. But we're really excited about that, and our storytellers will be announced very soon, and we hope to have some folks who are strong as Cicella on our bill that night, and we'll hope you'll be there. So, Adam?
All right. Our final storyteller tonight has been in front of audiences before, but not in this way. Please welcome the Reverend Junius Dodson.
Thank you.
I've preached literally thousands of sermons. But tonight, I share with you a different kind of story. It's my personal story, my battle and struggle with depression and my journey towards wholeness. The day that I hit the wall, the day that I fully understood the depths of depression and how it affected my life, was a day when I literally could not get out of bed. I wanted to, but I couldn't. So I lay there in complete darkness, because that's what I was feeling inside, darkness. And I was crying uncontrollably. My body was shaking. And I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I knew that it was something that I was going through, that I needed help. And I picked up the telephone, called my wife at the time, and I said to her, I need you to come home. And she said, what's wrong? I said, I don't know, but I need you to come home. And she came home. And I was there, literally under the covers, unable to move. And we reached out to a mental health professional, called a psychiatrist. And by the grace of God, I was able to get in an emergency appointment for that day. And as I went in and I talked with a professional for the first time, I talked to a person and I said, I need help. I'm in a crisis. I'm having a breakdown. And I know that this is beyond feeling blue. This is beyond I'm feeling down. I know that I'm in need of professional help right now. And so as I began this conversation with this professional, I began to learn a lot of things about myself. But the first thing she said to me was that you are having a major episode of depression. You're clinically depressed and you need help. You need medication. And when she suggested that I take medication, I initially resisted it because there was a stigma, particularly in my community, about taking medication. But I did, and she explained it to me in a way that I'd never heard. She said, this medication is not going to solve your problem, but it's going to lift the weight off of your shoulders so that you can re-engage life. And so I started taking medication. I had two forms of medication. And all my life, I've been a person of extreme highs and extreme lows. I was able to manage those pretty well. Matter of fact, the highs were pretty good because I got a lot of stuff done when I was on those highs. But the lows, over the years, they became deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's where I was on that particular day. I was in extreme low, and I couldn't pick myself back up. So I started taking this medication. And I started taking the medication and also continued with therapy, talking about issues. And there's some things I learned. I learned that my first battle, my first episode of depression happened when I was in middle school. When I was in middle school, I was a part of a group of students that was the first group of students to help integrate the Houston Independent School District. And I started attending a middle school. And the first semester of this school, we were not welcome at this school. And people were visually hostile to us as we would get off of the bus. And that was really my first episode of depression. I lost an entire semester of school. I did nothing. I went to school, I came home, and I slept. And I slept. And I slept. And the following semester, my mom took me out of the school. She put me into another place where I was able to thrive. But that was my first episode of depression, but I didn't recognize, couldn't articulate what it was. And then she also explained to me that there were some things I needed to do in terms of taking care of myself, like eating right. And there were things I needed to do in terms of understanding what my triggers were and vulnerability and all of those sort of things. Now, you have to know that here I was, a pastor, just started a new church, and things were going well on the outside, but on the inside, I was dying. And I was a pastor standing up, preaching hope, but I felt hopeless. I was talking about light, but all I felt was darkness. And so I had to come to grips with being vulnerable, that I was this person that people looked at as always having it all together. I was this person that people looked at and said, you know, he doesn't have any issues, any problems. He's always on top. But I had to come to grips with the image, the public image that people had of me, and really struggling with dealing with my own personal reality. And for the first time in my professional life, I was vulnerable. I had to learn that it was okay for me to be vulnerable, that it was okay for me to be able to say that everything's not okay with me. And in the midst of this conversation, in the midst of this counseling experience, I also learned that I hit that wall on that particular day, but there was a lot of things that led up to me hitting that wall. One of those things was I remember just driving around the city sometimes, and I would stop at a stoplight, and I would just start crying. I didn't know why, but I would. And I remember some days I would had reached out to a colleague, and I was telling him how I was feeling. And he said to me, "What do you have to be depressed about?" So I hid. Why am I depressed? I didn't know why, but I knew I needed help. And that was the beginning of my journey. And what I've learned and am learning over the course of all of these years is that there are still moments when I have to really fight to overcome my battle with depression. Most recently was in 2012. In 2012, I described this as the worst year of my life. In February of 2012, I lost my mother. And the loss of my mother, it threw me into another major episode of depression. And I was so low, I really honestly did not think I was going to make it out. In the same year, in August of that year, I lost my brother. Died of a heart attack, 49 years old. 2 weeks later, I lost my grandmother. She lived to be 99 years old. And then about a month after that, I lost one of my best friends from high school. In the midst of all of this activity throughout the year, I kept kept working, not really dealing with my grief, not really processing my grief. And the result of that was in November of that year, I ended up in a hospital with blood clots, pulmonary embolisms, blood clot in both of my lungs. And as I laid flat on my back in a hospital bed, it was an opportunity for me to be reminded by God of this struggle, but also that if I attended to health and the wholeness, that God could bring me through it. And so there I was, struggling, crying out again. And I was grateful, and I continue to be grateful for the things that I'm learning. Here's some things that I'm learning. I'm learning that my story matters. I'm learning that if I share my story and if I'm vulnerable with other people, that you never know who shares a similar story. You never know whose life I'm touching. I'm learning that. And I'm learning that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay that I don't have to have it all together. And so I'm also learning how to overcome this stigma of battling depression and anxiety, panic attacks. I'm learning that it's okay. And so part of me dispelling the stigma is to be able to stand before you tonight and to share my story. To say it's okay. To sometimes not be okay. It's okay to struggle. And it's okay to lean on other people as you make your way to health and wholeness. Thank you for listening to my story tonight.
Reverend Dodson, thank you so much. Can I have one more hand for all of our storytellers? Thank you guys so very much. Carl. What a gift you have shared with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And for the folks who have come, thank you for being here tonight. I also want to remind you, I guess, that if something resonated with you tonight, or you feel like you need help, or somebody close to you does, you know, there are some folks right here in the lobby tonight. There are folks from Centerstone. There are folks from Stars. And feel free to stop by at the literature tables on the way out. Just pick something up. Maybe there's something you can look at and you know, deal with down the road. But there is help, and there is hope. That's what I've gotten out of the stories tonight. And so, you know, please feel free to take advantage of that, and anything we can do to connect you, we'll be happy to. So glad you're here tonight. All the stories and the storytellers will be up at storytellersproject.com/Nashville in a few days. So I have to remind myself, storytellersproject.com/Nashville. So you can check out all these great stories again and share them with your friends who weren't here tonight. And we hope to see you again soon. But thank you so much for being a wonderful and gracious crowd tonight. And have a great night.